Very few people know that Vikings possessed a food preservation invention so revolutionary that it allowed them to store meat for years without using salt, and even fewer realize this technology was so effective that it fed armies, sustained transoceanic voyages, and built an empire that changed the map of Europe. What's truly shocking is that this invention wasn't some complex machinery or exotic chemical process. It was something far more ingenious, something that used the natural elements around them in ways that modern food science is only now beginning to fully understand and appreciate. Before we reveal exactly what this invention was and how it worked to preserve meat for literally years without spoilage, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of lost ancient technology fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will completely change what you thought you knew about Viking survival, and it might just save your life in a survival situation. The invention wasn't salting. It wasn't smoking, though that played a role. It wasn't even refrigeration, though cold was part of the system. It was something far more sophisticated, a multi-layered preservation technology that combined wind, acid, bacterial fermentation, and environmental engineering in ways that wouldn't be formally understood by science until the 20th century. A system so brilliant that when modern researchers attempted to recreate it using only period-accurate methods, they were stunned to discover that meat preserved this way remained not just edible, but nutritious after years of storage. And here's what makes this story even more remarkable. This knowledge almost disappeared completely. For centuries, historians assumed Vikings relied heavily on salt for food preservation, the same way other medieval civilizations did. But archaeological evidence and chemical analysis of preserved Viking Age food tells a completely different story. One that reveals an invention born from necessity, perfected through generations of observation, and lost when the Viking Age ended. But to understand why this invention mattered so profoundly, you first need to understand the problem Vikings faced. And it wasn't the problem most people think. Everyone assumes Vikings had easy access to salt. After all, they lived surrounded by ocean, right? They were seafaring raiders and traders who spent months on the water. Surely they could just evaporate seawater and have unlimited salt for preserving food. But here's the truth that very few people know. In Scandinavia during the 8th through 11th centuries, salt was a luxury item valued as highly as silver. It wasn't readily available to common people, and it certainly wasn't abundant enough to build an entire food security system around it. The process of extracting salt from seawater in the cold Scandinavian climate was incredibly labor-intensive and fuel-expensive. You had to evaporate enormous quantities of seawater to produce even small amounts of salt, and that required either vast amounts of firewood for boiling or specialized solar evaporation facilities that simply didn't exist in the frozen north. Most salt used in Scandinavia was actually imported, brought in by traders from warmer regions where solar evaporation was practical, or from underground salt mines in Central Europe. This made it expensive, scarce, and unreliable. A Viking settlement couldn't depend on imported salt arriving every season, especially during winters when trade routes froze or during times of war when supply lines were cut. So the Vikings faced a brutal equation. They needed to preserve massive quantities of meat and fish to survive winters that lasted half the year and to provision ships for voyages that could last months. They needed food that wouldn't spoil, wouldn't take up excessive space, and wouldn't require constant attention or fuel to maintain. But they couldn't rely on salt, the preservation method that the rest of medieval Europe used as standard. This constraint forced them to innovate. And what they created was something far more sophisticated than simple salting could ever achieve. The Viking preservation invention wasn't a single technique, it was an integrated system that used multiple natural forces working in harmony. Wind that turned flesh into stone. Acid produced by bacteria that created environments where spoilage couldn't occur. Smoke that deposited protective chemical compounds. And perhaps most remarkably, fermentation processes that transformed poisonous, inedible meat into safe, storable protein that could last for years. Each method complemented the others. Each addressed different types of food, different seasons, different storage needs. It was a complete technological ecosystem built from observation, experimentation, and intimate knowledge of natural processes that modern science wouldn't formally document for another 1,000 years. And the centerpiece of the system, the invention that very few people know about, was something called wind curing, combined with a preservation structure that turned entire coastlines into massive food production facilities capable of processing tons of fish and meat without using a single grain of salt. Now, if you're already fascinated by this lost Viking technology, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to reveal exactly how this system worked, step by step, and why it was so effective that modern attempts to recreate it have shocked food scientists. The foundation of the Viking preservation invention was understanding something that wouldn't be formally recognized by physics until centuries later: that removing moisture from food makes it impossible for the bacteria that cause spoilage to survive. No moisture means no bacterial growth. No bacterial growth means no rot. And in the cold, dry conditions of coastal Scandinavia, the Vikings discovered they could remove moisture from meat and fish using nothing but wind and time. But here's where it gets truly ingenious: they didn't just hang meat outside and hope for the best. They engineered specific structures designed to maximize airflow, control temperature, and create the perfect conditions for preservation on an industrial scale. These structures were called gel, massive wooden frames built from poles and crossbeams, assembled in locations specifically chosen for their wind patterns. The Vikings didn't build these randomly. They selected sites on rocky shores and cliffsides where cold Arctic winds blew constantly and predictably. Places where airflow was maximized and humidity was minimized. Places where nature itself would do the preservation work. Archaeological evidence shows these gel structures were enormous, some stretching for hundreds of meters along coastlines, capable of holding thousands upon thousands of fish or meat strips simultaneously. These weren't small family operations. These were industrial-scale food processing facilities built using nothing but wood, rope, and an understanding of environmental conditions that was centuries ahead of its time. The process itself reveals the sophistication of Viking observation and technique. Fish, usually cod caught during the winter fishing season when temperatures were ideal, were gutted carefully to remove the organs that spoil fastest. Then they were tied in pairs by their tails and draped over the horizontal poles of the gel structures. Thousands of fish hanging in precise rows, exposed to constant wind from all directions. The critical factor was temperature. The process had to occur in cold conditions, ideally just above freezing. Too warm, and bacteria would begin breaking down the flesh before moisture could be removed. Too cold, and the fish would freeze solid rather than drying properly. The Vikings timed their preservation cycles to match the narrow window when coastal temperatures hovered right at the ideal range, usually late winter and early spring in northern Norway. Over the course of several months, these hanging fish would lose up to 80% of their moisture content. The wind and cold slowly drew water from the flesh, concentrating proteins and creating an environment so dry that bacteria simply couldn't function. What remained was something called stockfish. Flesh so hard it resembled wood, so dry it weighed almost nothing, and so stable it could be stored for years without any additional preservation. This is the part that shocks modern food scientists. Stockfish produced this way contains no preservatives, no salt, no chemicals of any kind. It's simply fish that has been dehydrated through environmental control. Yet it remains edible and nutritious for 5, 10, even 20 years if stored properly. The protein content actually increases per unit of weight because water has been removed. A pound of stockfish contains far more nutrition than a pound of fresh fish. Before consumption, stockfish had to be rehydrated, soaked in water for days and beaten with wooden mallets to break down the rock-hard fibers. But once prepared, it became tender, flavorful, and provided the concentrated protein that fueled Viking warriors, sustained families through brutal winters, and provisioned ships crossing the North Atlantic. The scale of this operation cannot be overstated. Archaeological excavations at sites like Lofoten in Norway have revealed evidence of gel structures that must have processed thousands of tons of fish annually. This wasn't subsistence preservation, this was industrial food production that created a surplus. A tradable commodity. An economic foundation that funded Viking expansion and made long-distance raiding possible. But wind drying had limitations. It only worked in cold, dry conditions. It was most effective for lean fish and thin strips of meat. Fattier foods couldn't be preserved this way because fats go rancid when exposed to air, even in cold conditions. And in humid weather or during summer months, the method simply didn't work. Moisture in the air prevented proper drying, and warmer temperatures allowed bacterial growth. So the Vikings developed a second preservation method that complemented wind curing perfectly. And this technique is even less well known, even more surprising, and reveals a level of microbiological understanding that shouldn't have existed in the 9th century. They discovered they could use acid to preserve food, not vinegar, which requires agriculture and processing. Not citrus, which doesn't grow in Scandinavia. They used acid produced by bacteria, specifically, lactic acid created during the fermentation of dairy products. The Vikings were skilled livestock farmers. They produced enormous quantities of milk from cattle, sheep, and goats. From this milk, they made cheese, butter, and a thick fermented product called skyr that's still produced in Iceland today. All of these processes generated a byproduct that most cultures simply discarded: whey. Whey is the liquid that remains after milk has been curdled and strained to make cheese. It's thin, watery, and extremely sour because it's packed with lactic acid bacteria, the same beneficial bacteria used in yogurt, sauerkraut, and kimchi production today. Most medieval cultures saw whey as waste, something to feed to pigs or pour onto fields. The Vikings saw it as liquid gold, a free, abundant preservative that could prevent meat from spoiling without using any salt. The process they developed was ingenious. Meat or fish was cut into manageable pieces and packed tightly into wooden barrels. Then the barrels were completely filled with sour whey until every piece of meat was submerged. The barrels were sealed as airtight as possible and stored in cool cellars or even buried in the ground to maintain low temperatures. What happened next was bacterial warfare on a microscopic level. The lactic acid bacteria in the whey created an environment so acidic that the bacteria responsible for putrefaction, the organisms that cause meat to rot and become toxic, simply couldn't survive. Good bacteria prevented bad bacteria from growing. The meat was essentially pickled in a completely natural, cost-free preservative that was always available as long as the Vikings had dairy animals. Food preserved this way could last for months, even in relatively warm conditions. The meat took on a sour, tangy flavor, not to everyone's modern taste, but to people accustomed to fermented foods, it was perfectly acceptable. More importantly, it was safe, nutritious, and it required no fire, no expensive ingredients, no complex equipment. Just barrels, whey, and understanding of how bacteria behave. This method was called sursor in Old Norse, literally, sour-cured. In Iceland, where Viking food traditions survived longer than anywhere else due to geographic isolation, variations of this technique were used well into the 20th century for preserving everything from meat to fish to whale blubber. The genius of this dual system, wind curing for cold, dry conditions and acid preservation for humid or warm periods, was that it made Viking food security resilient. They weren't dependent on a single method that could fail if conditions changed. They had options. Adaptability. A complete preservation technology that worked year-round regardless of weather. But the Vikings didn't stop there. They had one more preservation technique that was so effective, so reliable, and so important to their expansion that it deserves its own explanation. A method that used the third element, fire, but not in the way you'd expect. The third element, smoke, as chemical engineering. When wind drying was impossible due to humidity and there weren't enough fermented dairy products available, the Vikings deployed their third preservation weapon, smoke. But this wasn't simple cooking over a fire. This was sophisticated chemical engineering that deposited protective compounds onto meat and fish at the molecular level, a process that modern food science has confirmed was genuinely brilliant. The Vikings practiced two distinct types of smoking, and understanding the difference reveals just how much they knew about food preservation through observation alone. Hot smoking was essentially cooking. Meat or fish was placed close to an open fire and roasted while being saturated with smoke. The result was cooked food with a smoky flavor that had to be eaten within days. This was useful for immediate consumption but useless for long-term storage. It wasn't part of their preservation invention. Cold smoking was the true art, a slow, careful process that could preserve food for months or even years. And very few people understand how radically different it was from hot smoking. In cold smoking, the products were placed in a specialized smokehouse or closed chamber positioned far away from the actual fire source. The fire burned in a pit or separate structure, and only the smoke, cooled to temperatures between 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, entered the preservation chamber through underground channels or long wooden flues. This cool smoke slowly enveloped the meat and fish over days or even weeks. During this extended exposure, something remarkable happened at the chemical level. The smoke deposited substances called phenols and aldehydes, organic compounds found in burning wood, onto the surface of the food. These compounds had powerful bactericidal properties, meaning they actively killed bacteria. They created a protective chemical barrier that prevented microorganisms from colonizing the meat's surface. At the same time, the gentle heat and air movement from the smoke slowly drew moisture from the food without cooking it. The combination of dehydration and chemical protection made the product incredibly stable. Properly cold-smoked meat or fish could last for months in cool storage, and unlike stockfish, it didn't require extensive soaking and preparation before eating. The Vikings were remarkably sophisticated about which wood they used for smoking. Different woods produced different smoke chemistry and imparted different flavors. Alder was preferred for fish. It burned cool and clean, producing smoke with a mild flavor that didn't overpower delicate flesh. Juniper was used for special occasions and valuable meats, imparting a distinctive aromatic quality. Beech created smoke that was particularly good for long-term preservation of fatty meats. This wasn't random tradition or superstition. Modern analysis confirms that different woods do produce measurably different preservative compounds in their smoke. The Vikings had figured this out through generations of careful observation and experimentation, documenting which woods worked best for which foods through oral tradition and practical teaching. The smokehouses themselves were engineering marvels of simplicity. Often they were nothing more than pits dug into hillsides and covered with branches, or small wooden sheds with no windows and strategically placed vents. The critical requirement was maintaining a constant flow of thick, cool smoke while preventing any open flames from reaching the food. This required constant monitoring. Someone had to tend the fire day and night for weeks, carefully controlling airflow and fuel addition to maintain perfect conditions. Smoked foods became a crucial part of Viking provisions. Unlike stockfish, which was rock-hard and required extensive preparation, smoked meat and fish could be eaten with minimal processing. It was ideal for warriors on campaign or sailors on long voyages who needed food that was ready to eat, wouldn't spoil, and provided concentrated nutrition. But even with wind-drying, acid preservation, and smoking, the Vikings faced certain foods that resisted all these methods. Fatty foods like butter and oil couldn't be wind-dried, the fats would oxidize and go rancid. They couldn't be effectively smoked for the same reason. And they certainly couldn't be preserved in acidic way. So the Vikings developed a fourth preservation technique that sounds absolutely insane by modern standards but was based on perfect understanding of environmental conditions. They buried their most valuable foods in the ground and in peat bogs for months or even years. Underground preservation, using the earth as a refrigerator. In the far northern latitudes where Vikings settled, places like Iceland, northern Norway, and Greenland, the ground froze deeply during winter and in some locations never fully thawed even in summer. This permafrost was essentially a natural freezer, and the Vikings recognized its potential immediately. They dug deep cellars and pits, excavating down into the permanently frozen ground or reaching depths where temperatures remained just above freezing year-round. In these underground chambers, meat, fish, and especially butter could be stored for months, remaining fresh exactly like food in a modern refrigerator. The cold prevented bacterial growth. The darkness prevented light-based degradation. And the stable temperature meant no freeze-thaw cycles that would damage cellular structure. This method required no technology beyond the physical labor of digging. No fuel. No special equipment. Just knowledge of where to dig and how deep to go to reach the stable cold zone. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia have found the remains of these storage cellars as integral parts of Viking settlements. Not occasional luxuries, but standard infrastructure that every substantial farmstead possessed. But even more remarkable, and this is the part that sounds completely bizarre until you understand the science, was the practice of bog preservation. Peat bogs weren't just dangerous wetlands to be avoided. To the Vikings, they were massive natural canning systems. Peat moss, specifically sphagnum moss, creates a unique environment when it decomposes. The water in peat bogs becomes extremely acidic, sometimes with pH levels comparable to vinegar. The decomposition process also consumes all available oxygen, creating an anaerobic environment where oxygen-dependent bacteria cannot survive. And the cool temperatures of northern bogs mean that even bacteria that don't need oxygen grow very slowly or not at all. The Vikings lowered wooden barrels filled with butter into these bogs. Protected by the barrel and surrounded by the acidic, oxygen-free, cold environment of the peat, the butter entered a kind of suspended animation. Bacterial decomposition stopped almost completely. The butter could remain there for years. Some archaeological finds suggest decades, without spoiling. When barrels of this bog butter are discovered by archaeologists today, the contents are often still recognizable as butter, though they've taken on a waxy texture and absorbed some of the peat's distinctive smell. Chemical analysis shows that the fat molecules are still largely intact, and the product would have been edible to people accustomed to its acquired flavor. The same principle was probably applied to meat. Meat wrapped in hides or sealed in containers could be lowered into peat bogs, where the acidic, anaerobic environment would essentially mummify it. Bacteria couldn't break it down. The meat would take on a distinctive preservation that made it safe for human consumption after processing, even years later. Today it seems insane to bury food in a swamp and consider it preserved. But in a world without artificial refrigeration or industrial preservatives, it was brilliant environmental engineering, using the natural chemistry of the landscape to solve a critical survival problem. The extreme method, fermentation taken to the limit. But perhaps the most shocking technique in the Viking preservation arsenal, the method that truly reveals how desperate their need was and how sophisticated their understanding became, was extreme fermentation. And the most famous example is something that still exists today in Iceland, hakarl, fermented shark meat. This technique addressed what seems like an impossible problem. Greenland sharks were abundant in Arctic waters and represented tons of potential protein. But their flesh is naturally toxic when fresh, packed with urea and trimethylamine oxide that make it poisonous to humans. Eating fresh Greenland shark meat would cause severe illness or death. Most cultures would simply avoid this food source entirely. The Vikings couldn't afford to waste that much protein. So they developed a months-long fermentation and detoxification process that transformed poisonous meat into edible, storable food. The process reveals understanding of biochemistry that shouldn't have existed in the 9th century. First, the shark carcass was gutted and cut into large pieces. These pieces were placed in pits dug into gravel or sand near the ocean shore. The pits were covered and weighted down with heavy stones, sometimes hundreds of pounds of pressure. Under this pressure, the meat was left to ferment for 6 weeks to 3 months. During this time, the toxic liquids were literally squeezed out of the flesh and drained into the ground. Simultaneously, bacterial fermentation broke down the dangerous compounds into less toxic forms. Complex biochemical transformations occurred as microorganisms worked on the flesh. After this initial fermentation, the meat was removed from the pits. It was no longer acutely poisonous, but it had acquired an incredibly pungent ammonia smell and taste. The process wasn't finished yet. The fermented shark pieces were then hung on the same gel structures used for wind-drying fish. There they hung for several more months, slowly drying in the cold Arctic wind. The wind carried away much of the ammonia smell and further concentrated the flesh into a hard, shelf-stable product. The result was hakarl, something that modern tourists describe as one of the most challenging foods they've ever encountered. It tastes of ammonia, has a strong chemical smell, and bears little resemblance to anything we'd recognize as fish. But it's pure concentrated protein that could be stored for years and saved countless lives during Iceland's harshest winters. This willingness to develop such extreme preservation methods shows just how critical food security was to Viking survival, and how far they were willing to push fermentation science to solve their problems. Storage logistics, the final piece of the system. Creating preserved food was only half the challenge. Storing it properly so it remained intact through months of humidity, temperature changes, and pest pressure required its own engineering solutions. On land, the Vikings built specialized storage structures called stabber, barns raised above the ground on pillars. This elevation solved multiple problems simultaneously. It protected supplies from ground moisture and seasonal flooding. The pillars were made smooth or wrapped with metal to prevent rodents from climbing up, creating rodent-proof storage without poison or traps. Inside dwellings, underground cellars maintained consistently cool temperatures ideal for barrels of fermented products, sour milk preparations, and beer. The cellar was the strategic heart of a Viking household, their insurance against starvation. Dried products like stockfish and smoked meat were stored hanging in attics or under barn roofs where air circulation prevented moisture accumulation. The Vikings understood that even dried food would spoil if stored in damp, still air. For sea voyages, storage became even more critical. Only the most reliable and compact supplies went aboard the ships. Wooden barrels, crafted by Viking coopers who were masters of their trade, held fermented meats, butter, and beer. These barrels were strong enough to withstand the violent rocking of Atlantic storms and airtight enough to protect their contents from salt spray. Stockfish was ideal for ships because it was light, compact, and needed no container. Warriors could carry personal supplies, and communal stores could be packed efficiently in every available space below deck. The combination of preserved foods taken on a typical Viking voyage reveals the complete system in action. Stockfish for protein, dried or smoked meat for variety, cheese for fat and calories, fermented products for ready-to-eat nutrition, and barrels of beer for safe hydration. Each item was the result of a different preservation technique, and together they provided complete nutrition for crews spending months at sea. Legacy. Why this invention still matters. What's truly remarkable is that these Viking preservation methods didn't disappear when the Viking Age ended. They survived, evolved, and became the foundation of Scandinavian culinary identity. Norwegian stockfish is still produced today using identical techniques, the same gel structures, the same wind-drying process, the same months-long curing period. It's now an expensive gourmet product exported to Italy, Portugal, and around the world. What was born from necessity is now a delicacy. Icelandic hakkarl still exists as a national dish and cultural touchstone. It's offered to tourists as an extreme culinary challenge, but for Icelanders it represents their ancestors' ingenuity and refusal to surrender to their brutal environment. Swedish surströmming, fermented herring that's famous for its powerful smell, is a direct descendant of Viking acid preservation techniques. It remains part of Swedish food culture despite, or perhaps because of, its challenging nature. Smoking techniques perfected by Vikings form the basis of Scandinavian smoked salmon production, which is now a global industry. The cheese and skyr production methods are alive and thriving, with skyr now marketed internationally as a health food. The Viking preservation invention, this integrated system of wind, acid, smoke, fermentation, and environmental engineering, wasn't just a survival technique. It was a complete technological revolution that enabled an entire civilization to thrive in conditions that would have destroyed others. Very few people know this story. Fewer still understand that what we call traditional Scandinavian foods are actually the preserved remnants of a sophisticated preservation science developed over centuries of observation and refinement. And perhaps most importantly for us today, every single one of these techniques still works. In survival situations, in off-grid living, in disaster preparedness, The Viking preservation methods remain as effective as they were 1,000 years ago. No electricity required. No industrial equipment needed. Just knowledge, natural materials, and understanding of how bacteria, moisture, temperature, and time interact. The Vikings didn't just survive. They built an empire on dried fish and fermented meat. They crossed oceans on provisions that required no refrigeration. They created a food system so resilient that it lasted for centuries and still influences how we eat today. That's the invention very few people know about. That's the technology that changed the medieval world. And now you're one of the few who understands how it actually worked.